So, welcome to another Dissident podcast. I'm happy today to be joined by Professor Richard Sakwa. And it's perhaps you've not heard of him, but he is a professor of some renown within the area of political scholarship and has been most recently tied to the University of Kent. But I will let Professor Sakwa introduce himself. Richard, please feel welcome to the Dissident podcast here in Sweden.
Well, it's great to be with you. I must say, I love the name, the Dissident Podcast, because I think that's exactly what we've all turned into nowadays, dissidents. And so I'm very happy to be with you. Yep, as you say, I was at the University of Kent and uh, published a number of books. My latest big one was called The Lost Peace. It was basically how we squandered the potential for a more substantive, what I would call a positive peace order at the end of the Cold War in 1989-91. That's we can talk about that, but the absolute latest book is called, which ties on to your dissident theme. It's called The Culture of the Second Cold War, in which that's it. Thank you. Great. In which I basically say the way that, if you like, Western liberal societies have become, or increasingly, or in danger of becoming, involuted. That is, inward-looking, hermetic, unable to engage in dialogue with others, increasingly not just with those outside, but also with different views, pluralistic and dissenting views internally. And we've seen some, even since the book came out, some spectacular cases. For example, Jacques Baud, B-A-U-D, the Swiss diplomat and scholar, who's done some excellent books on the Ukraine war, who was sanctioned by the European Union, by European Commission. And of course, that meant that his bank accounts were frozen and those of his wife. It's quite extraordinary. And what was he? Well, first of all, there was no criminal or no process engaged. It was just a unilateral, arbitrary decision. And the question was, what was he guilty of? Having dissident views or different views. And, it was his work is of good scholarship. So basically, that's why I decided to write it, because my argument is that the culture of this second Cold War, in some ways, is worse than it was in the first Cold War. Because at least in the first Cold War, yes, of course, there was McCarthyism, Red Scare, and so on. But I think that there was still respect for alternative viewpoints. This one, where this Cold War is much less focused. In the past, it was communism versus capitalism, Soviet Union versus the United States and its allies. Now it's far more amorphous, but it seems to have spread far deeper roots and poisoning far more of societal relations than the first one. So that's the sort of work I do.
And that's very interesting work, obviously. And there are a multitude of questions I would like to ask you. But as we know, you have to keep podcasts under a certain amount of time, otherwise you will lose the listener's interest. But I thought I would. You argue in some of your writings that this international system is in a deep crisis, considering that both the political West and the political East they're kind of justifying their actions with very selective interpretations of what you refer to as the charter principles, like sovereignty, self-determination, and the international legal historical the legal international law framework. Is the system fundamentally unworkable in a multipolar world where you have these clashes, or can the charter principles still be a basis and serve as a viable neutral framework if the political will were to exist? Is it still a viable system? Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Oh, I understand absolutely perfectly, and this is absolutely the how can I put it, the 65,000 krona question, right at the center of absolutely everything I've been doing. So to try to keep the argument clear, I'd say that at the moment at least three things are going on. The first one is that the Charter International System, established in 1945, based on United Nations, a whole stack of international laws, norms, conventions, uh, 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 is the framework for international politics. So that's the Charter system. It's now, last year, we celebrated its 80th anniversary. The second thing that was going on is that at the level of international politics, we've had a conflict of models of world order. So I distinguish between the system, the international system, that is United Nations, and models of world order. In the old days, the first Cold War, which I just mentioned, you had a conflict between the world order based on the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, with its own ideology, its own alliance system, and so on. That, of course, collapsed between 1989 and 91, which left the main alternative model of world order, which is the US-led, what I call the political West. Why do I call it the political West? Because I'm arguing that after 1945, the West, the Western, that is the United States and its Western European allies, the state system was transformed by the Atlantic Alliance system. That's NATO, European Union, many other elements, with two key features or facets to it. The first one is the positive one, you could call it, of this political West, the Commonwealth aspect. That is free trade. Some people criticize it, but nevertheless, a also in the early years, space for Keynesian development of social welfarism, the welfare state, social democracy. Uh, and of course, the vision of economic dynamism of one form or another, but certainly delivering of certain public goods, the Commonwealth aspect. The second feature or facet of the political West is the uh, empire, imperial aspect, if you could say, which, because obviously the political West was a US-led body, if you like it or not. This political West, which first of all waged the first Cold War, after 1989-91, this political West radicalized. It basically claimed that this so-called liberal international order, a rules-based order, call it what you like, this this model of world order radicalized in all sorts of ways. It claimed to be universal. So this model of US-led political West, liberal international order, claimed to be universal. It was not. And right from the start, Russia said, no, this isn't universal. We're certainly willing to accept and recognize the leadership of the United States, because obviously the most powerful country in the world, Russia, of course, coming out the Soviet Union very weak. But they certainly weren't going to accept it as the substitute for the charter system. That's what basically happened after the end of the First Cold War. It basically is US-led system, the rules-based order, claimed to be universal, and thus it usurped the powers, the privileges, even the norms of this charter system. So we've been this sort of implicit tension for 30 or 40 years. It's now coming home to roost. These excesses of the political West has, first of all, internally becoming less and less coherent. And then, of course, you've got Donald J. Trump comes along and says, look, we don't need this political West. We, that is, the United States, is the most powerful country in the world. We don't need this political West. So it's now defecting from the alliance system which it established. This is the NATO, the alliance system, Atlantic power system, more than just NATO. It's a whole network of norms, relationship, the Five Eyes, a whole stack of institutions. So the United States is now defecting, just like Russia defected from the Soviet Union, most astonishingly, in the late 1980s from the system and its own empire even, which was a bizarre outcome. Today we're seeing an equally bizarre outcome where the United States is defecting from the dominance of the political West. This leaves the Europeans completely at sixes and sevens, haven't got a clue how to react. They've enjoyed 80 years effectively of the US security umbrella, but they've also outsourced not just their security, they've outsourced strategic thinking. What is Europe? What is the purpose? And so those are the, if you like, the two strands going on. And the third one, of course, the final one, so not to go on for too long, is that this radical political West, which is now, if you like, divorcing its two wings, the US side of it and the Western European side, are splitting, the great unraveling, as some of us call it, on the one side. But the third process is that we have the emergence of, I don't know what to call it, let's call it a political East, with Russia, with China, with India, with the institutions are BRICS plus now 10 countries in it, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This political East isn't quite as I think as you suggested. What they are is and this is a final point, that they are neo-revisionist. Russia, China, India, they claim to be in defense of the universality of the United Nations-based Charter international system. They are therefore very status quo. They're conservative powers in this normative level of the international system. However, at the level of international politics, where models of world order clash, this third model of world order is emerging, this political East, which is in defense of sovereign internationalism, which is the fundamental core principle of the United Nations. So that's a long answer, but I hope that makes sense. So we're seeing that's a sort of the way I see the dynamics of international affairs at the moment. And just to finally to go to your crucial point, unfortunately, as this political West is unraveling, it is in danger of dragging down the Charter international system with it. That is, the United Nations. It's already, we saw United States just before Christmas or just after, is leaving 66 international organizations, including 30 UN agencies, World Health Organizations, and so on. The United States, even before Trump, it's been a long way. Its adieu to the political West has taken a long time. It hasn't been sending a judge to the appellate court of the World Trade Organization. So for a long time, the United States was defecting from not only the political West, but also from the charter system, which it did so much to establish in 1945. Obviously, the host conference was in San Francisco. So it's going it alone. So, which is, an absolutely catastrophic, because many of us would say, look, this political West, it served its purposes. Now we need a new agenda. So I'm going on too long, but I just want to add one more key point, because
Please
that
go ahead.
new agenda is the one that I've been arguing for 30, 40 years since the end of the Cold War. We needed, right from the start, a pan-continental vision. That is, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, a post-American Europe, not an anti-American one, certainly not. We all have many good friends in the United States, and we want to work with them if they can work with us. But a post-American Europe. This is what Gorbachev, well, de Gaulle talked about it earlier, and many other leaders. Gorbachev's Common European Home, Francois Mitterrand's Confederation of Europe, Putin, Большая Европа, Greater Europe, and so many more. And of course, this is a neo-Gaullist vision of a Europe of nation states, sovereign states, but internationalist, working together. And that is the vision which we failed to implement after 1989-91 in favor of Atlanticism. So we need today, the strategic challenge is to formulate a new post-American European continentalism with Russia, not against it. Of course, you may say that's utopian, but that's where we need to go.
Exactly. You say utopian. There are so many questions that pop into my head when I listen to your wonderful answer. But things like change. I mean, change. If you look at the current trajectory, it potentially could lead to greater anarchy. And what are the potential practical pathways to reconcile these norms with a political practice? I mean, would reform of the charter system be sufficient, or does the future need a classical historical clash of orders to necessitate an entirely new conceptual foundation for the governance of the globe? So, I mean, the depressing answer is kind of a question is more: do we need a greater world war in order for a new system to be born, like it has so many times before with the Napoleonic Wars and World War II and so on? Do you think we need that, or can, within the framework of the different existing orders, can diplomacy win out, and can we change the system without having to have this great conflict of nations once again?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Everybody today is talking about global disorder, just say global anarchy, and so on. But within the framework of my sort of model, my two-level model, and of course there's a third level, which is international political economy, and there's a fourth level as well, transnational civil society. But leaving those to one side at the moment, uh, that's absolutely the crucial question. The international system, the Charter International System, was born out of the catastrophe of the Second World War. With the Atlantic Charter, the United Nations Declaration, which China, even in the middle of a civil war and fighting Japan, signed up to, and others. Just to say that this Charter International System builds on and develops the principles from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, after the catastrophic 30 Years' War, after the Treaty of Utrecht, which introduced diplomacy, and of course, after, as you mentioned, the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna, which introduced, balance of power, spheres of interests, all sorts of concert of power. And of course, then we had the fourth European international system, which was Versailles, 1919, which introduced a lot of new ideas, but also ultimately clearly failed. And so therefore, this charter system came after another war and sought to learn and incorporate the lessons of the earlier sister international systems. And as you say, I mean, heaven forbid that we need another war, because that the next war, global war, that is, world war, will be the last war. So, and second, there are no alternative major ideas waiting in the wings to be implemented, except so. I will answer your question absolutely directly. Yes, a lot of those people who were always in the past the most ardent defenders of the United Nations and the whole body of law which it has spawned. But even some of my friends, are beginning to say, look, this charter system is not working. The United Nations is not working, and palpably it's not. At the moment, there are 60 wars going on now, which is more than any more wars going on now than at any time since 1945. And the United Nations is, how can I put it? It's signally absent. I mean, clearly Guterres is, doing some minor things, because the Security Council, the permanent 5 members, are not working. The principle is that the 5 permanent members have a special responsibility. Already 10, 15 years ago, I was shocked at the way that the British, the French, and the Americans would gang up and dominate, and of course against Russia and China, which have tended to vote together as well, which has led to a paralysis of the Security Council. The non-permanent members have made an important contribution, but are not able to overcome the veto. And of course, the other emphasis to all of that is that the United Nations General Assembly should and has within the charter, UN Charter, has reserve powers. But unbelievably, they elected the former German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, as the chair of the General Assembly. And the British have dominated for many, many years the UN Secretariat. And they've effectively, in a Thatcherite manner, privatized it. So there's all sorts of tensions and contradictions there in this charter system, not making work quite. And of course, the big one is that it's the 5 permanent members should have been expanded years ago with the addition, not of more members of the political West, which includes Japan or Germany, but with obviously India, obviously Brazil, clearly representation of 2 members, 2 mighty nations from Africa to be decided by the African Union, maybe a rotating membership. Obviously, Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa, some others could rotate and share that position, but that's up to them. But that should have happened a long time ago. So, just a final point, as you say, utopianism, that we cannot abandon this charter system, the United Nations. We know the Ukrainians want to. We know that Israel treats it with contempt, which is catastrophic. So, but the only thing I would say is no, we cannot abandon this charter system, UN system, because there is, without it, even though it's relatively powerless, it sets the standard of what is legitimate and what the standard of behavior should be in international politics. And on that basis, we can judge that Donald J. Trump and many others deviate from those norms and standards. So without it, we really will be in it wouldn't be just global disorder. It will be systemic chaos. At the moment, we have political chaos. If you see from the clash of orders, we have China and Russia speaking in defense of the charter system. But of course, they've got, well, Russia has its own conflicts and China has its own issues.
Well, looking at Russia, we have both spent time in Russia. Me during the turbulent 90s, and you over years in between there, and looking at Russia today, in your you refer to Russia sometimes. You argue that we're witnessing certain trends. You argue that you have this modified bipolarity in the form of the US-China power competition. And then we have those traditional legacy powers, the old great powers, the ones that you mentioned in the Security Council, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany now. But then if we go to Russia now, you describe Russia as struggling to avoid being regulated to its legacy status, which perhaps maybe is a key driver in the Ukraine conflict for them to assert a kind of domination. And you call them the incomplete superpower, like the Soviet Union once was referred to as the incomplete great power. Are the actions in Ukraine driven by a Russian fear of decline? And is it a kind of assertment or an attempt to keep its status within this new power transitions that are going on, which you described in the previous answer? I'm just trying to figure out where Russia's actions stem from. What's in the mind of the Russian government at the moment?
Yeah, that is one credible theory. My view is that ultimately, yes, Russia has its own challenges and difficulties, clearly, and has had for a long time. That was quite a long time ago, and I talked about it in incomplete. And of course, all states effectively are incomplete in one way or another. But this conflict is not, in my view, driven by either fears of losing status and attempt to regain a great power status. That's a first model. I don't think it's driven by internal conflicts, because this is the classic liberal argument that says that Russia's regime was needed an external war to revalidate and relegitimate itself and consolidate its power. I don't accept that model. The third argument, that it's an imperial land grab to reconstitute the Soviet Union. My view, very, very strongly even, is that this was an intensifying security dilemma, which has been building and budding for 30 years, going all the way back to 1990, when there were the debates about German unification and whether NATO would enlarge beyond the unified Germany, or even that the unified Germany would be within NATO. Can I add a footnote here, as it were, to bracket this while I'll come back to the mainstream of the argument?
Of course, of
Is
course.
that ultimately where we are today in Europe is, I actually insist nowadays, or argue, that it's a single unity for the last 80 years, since 1945 to 1985, that the issue in 1945 was the debates at the Potsdam Great Power Conference, Stalin, Truman, and Churchill and Attlee, that the implicit idea was, or the idea was, that there would be a neutral Germany, a unified, neutral, non-militarized Germany. The United States, and of course with its allies in Europe, which were devastated, followed. This is what provoked the First Cold War. And paradoxically, Germany and the status of Germany again provoked the Second Cold War. So, in the First Cold War, the Stalin Note of 1952, we now have the archival material. It was a genuine status. Let us establish this neutral, non-aligned Germany in the heart of Europe, which would immediately have ended the Cold War, ended conflict, and so on. Of course, the West didn't want it to go communist or be leftist, and so on. There's obviously complicated issues. But so at least you could excuse them. And of course, Khrushchev came back to this idea. When that failed, then he built the Berlin Wall. But the same thing is, after 1989-91, that yes, Gorbachev accepted the unification of Germany. In the Treaty of June 1990, he did not put in that treaty, which he should have done, that Germany or that NATO will not enlarge beyond the United Germany, and that is the weed, or the evil worm in the machine since then, and it's grown and metastasized, and it created a huge, if you like, fear in the Russian elite, that clearly, and especially when it came to Ukraine joining NATO, promised in Bucharest in April 2008. Even at that time, Gorbachev opposed NATO enlargement. Yeltsin opposed NATO enlargement. So it isn't anything just Putin. It's a national fear, because obviously Russia has been invaded many times. I'm speaking, obviously, to a Swedish audience. And of course, we usually in the list, we talk about the Mongols, we talk about the Prussians, the Teutons, and of course, we talk about the Swedish invasion, which ended in Poltava in 1709, which I'm sorry to remind you guys of it. And then, of course, many German invasions and the French invasion and so on. So, there's a strategic culture, a deep strategic culture, which is constant invasion, no defensible, natural borders, certainly not in the West. And so it's, yeah, absolutely. Russia did not need this war, contrary to what the liberals and others would say, because in 2021, the Russian economy had turned a corner, despite the sanctions since 2014 over Crimea and other issues, that despite the sanctions, economic growth was restored. The economy was doing quite well. And it didn't need this war. And so many, but by the way, in my book, which is due to come out in March on the Russo-Ukrainian war, I detail quite clearly those within the Russian elite who opposed the war for economic reasons. It said it'd be devastating. And of course, it has shifted the economy towards a form of a war economy, a militarized military Keynesianism. But it survived. And in fact, Russian war Russia is now, as part of this war, of course, it's had huge economic, financial, and obviously personnel losses. But Russia has emerged out of this war much stronger as a powerful player in global politics. Obviously, it's busy with this war, so it hasn't been able to engage. But almost every day, the Russian leadership is meeting with people from the Middle East. For example, even as we speak, the Syrian leader Al Jolani, or whatever his new name is, has is going to Moscow, and there's a constant. There's Africans. They're preparing a third African summit. So Russia remains a major player. I don't believe that this Western political science keeps talking about status seeking or loss of status. Status isn't something you can do artificially. It emerges simply out of your behavior. And Russia's got a very powerful, very long diplomatic tradition going back to from the Soviet years and before that to Imperial Russia. It's a whole vast network of think tanks um, in Russia. I mean, for example, and institutions of the Academy of Sciences, and there's still, by the way, a very active debate within Russia. The idea that it's a sort of a totalitarian society. Yes, there's repression. Yes, it's a hard authoritarian system today. Yes, that you've got to be very careful what you say in society. Yet within certain circles, and I know this from personal experience, there is a huge, I mean, no one likes this war. No one likes this war. The basic feeling is, as often in Russia, they have to see it to some sort of satisfactory conclusion, a grim task. And the conclusion is not the destruction of Ukraine. It is the transformation of Ukraine so that it is no longer a security threat. That means no, it's this coalition of the killing, or sorry, coalition of the willing, with Western troops in Ukraine. The whole war is to stop that. And the fact that they can still come back with this idea is just madness.
Yes, the madness of King Charles is nothing in
Yeah.
comparison with the madness of
Madness of
Kaja
King
Kallas.
George.
King George, sorry.
Yes, King
Yes,
George. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Don't say
the
anything
madness
nasty
of
about our nice new king, King Charles
yeah,
III.
oh, my apologies.
That's okay.
And I just have to add that on a historical note, I'm a legal scholar and a legal historian. I have to say that the two countries that have spent the most years in history fighting have actually been the Swedes and the Danes.
Mm.
So when you talk about old grievances, it's for us Swedes, it's been the Danes, but that in itself proves that any two countries who have been intertwined in conflict for no matter how many years can eventually become the best of
Yeah.
friends. So I mean,
Yes.
it's just about politics. It's not about anything else. And going back to Denmark,
Can I just
in
say that? Can I
it's
just say on
of
that
course,
point? You're
of course,
absolutely right that many people say that there's, of course, intense hatred today between the Russians and Ukrainians. Yet any part of this peace process would have to be some sort of reconciliation between these two peoples, just as there was between France and Germany after 1945. So, no, that's a crucial point. People would say it's a fantasy, but no, this really has to be, as you say, if you say Sweden and the Danes were fighting but each other for so long.
yeah, we exactly. I think we fought
Mm.
13 wars in total, and
Really?
the amount of years that those wars amount to in total are actually on a Guinness record level the most amount of years that any two nations have been in war throughout
Mm,
recorded history. So as you can see, we Swedes and we Danes, we really hated each other for
mm,
political reasons. But then today, I mean, we love the Danes, and
yeah.
or I wouldn't say love, but we get along
Well, you've got
in
this
way.
bridge from, was it across, what's the
Yeah,
name of the bridge?
for the
Östersund.
Öresund Bridge.
Yes.
between
Yeah.
Copenhagen and Malmö. So yeah, it's
Mm.
my point is that any two nations can reconcile if there is a political will to reconcile, because
Yes.
most people living on a day-to-day basis, they care more about their work, their children's education, their love life than they do about hating someone. So I
Yes.
mean, as long as there's a political will, there will always be a way.
Can I just add to that? This
Yes.
is one thing which really has upset me for so long, and that is the way that the political West, the Anglo-Saxons in particular, have fostered hatred between Russia and Ukraine. That Brzezinski, if you remember, all the way back to the 1990s, said we
Yes.
must not allow Russia and Ukraine to align. And so, obviously, I respect and that Russia did the independence of a sovereign, democratic, but neutral, non-aligned Ukraine. Then it could have acted as a bridge rather than a barrier. But this
Yes.
was not what the Anglo-Saxons wanted. Absolutely not. So the US embassy in Kiev was fostering constantly this antagonism and dividing a wedge. But on the other side, so many of my friends, uh, uh, for example, I won't give his name, a leading professor in St. Petersburg. He's living in St. Petersburg. His sister lives in Kiev, and two brothers lived in the Donbass, so in Donetsk. So a family of four, a sister in Kiev now suffering all the power cuts and the suffering now. This doesn't mean just this intertwining. You know that when Putin called them one people, in a sense he was right, and that did not mean there should be one state. Today we respect the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine as long as it sticks to its principles, which it outlined in its Declaration of State Sovereignty in 1990, Declaration of Independence in 91, to be neutral. It's, you know, if, for example, your friends, the Danes, wanted to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization instantaneously, you know, you'd have Swedish troops there again within 5 minutes. If Ireland, which is a neutral state today, Ireland, you know, Republic of
Yeah.
Ireland,
Of
wanted
course.
to join, you know, a former empire, it's neutral, marvelous country, you know, wanted to, you know, if the Chinese were going to be building a military base there, the British would immediately abandon its language, which it used about Ukraine. Every country can make its own, can join any military alliance it wants to. It's madness. Of course, this was a lie from the very start, but it was a demagogic lie. And as a result, 1 million people have died. Two countries have been destroyed, Ukraine and Russia suffering enormously. And Europe has been driven into marginalization, militarization, and the destruction of our public sphere.
Of course, and I think it was made quite clear in the rhetoric of Donald J. Trump now or just recently in Venezuela, when he was referring to the fact that I think they actually managed to say that both Hezbollah and Hamas was involved in Venezuela and were a threat to U.S. national
Mm,
security. And then if somebody said, but you know, every country has its right to, and you know, they were immediately cut off. So of
yeah,
course it's this Anglo-Saxon hypocrisy.
yeah.
I
Double
just wanted
standards. Yeah,
double standards. Yes,
yeah.
I just wanted quickly to return to Denmark. In the 90s, I picked up a book at a bookshop in Copenhagen, and that was Francis Fukuyama's End of History thesis, the one where he proclaimed liberal democracy's ultimate triumph after the Cold War. And when I read what you have written, you have argued that it has had some negative consequences.
Yes.
Uh, and I was just wondering, you know, by saying that the Soviet communism, that the collapse was the end of history, it kind of stopped or hindered the chance to revive a more profound and humane socialism, or kind of create a new form of a new form of responsible liberalism. Would you say that the current crisis of the liberal democracy, is there a chance of a resurgence of a socialism, or is there a viable post neoliberal ideology out there, or perhaps is that what China is demonstrating today? Or what are your thoughts of this mischance on socialism? Can it be revived today, 30 years later, or do you have any takes on this?
Yes, absolutely. So you're absolutely right that this the ideology of the end of history, and of course all the other stuff, the Hegelian historicism, which is an Kantian hypostasis of human rights rather than other things. All these things did was close down debate, close down options, and so the end of communism were basically, it was a negative revolution. It actually offered nothing new, which was astonishing to me right from the start. This was a great opportunity to return to some of those issues now that the military confrontation had eased, that you had Russia and all the other countries hoping to reestablish sovereignty, independent countries, to pursue their own paths towards modernity, to develop maybe functioning dynamic economies based on various market principles, but like Sweden, maybe a managed market and so on. So all of that was, and of course, revising the security framework of Europe. And all of that was closed down. So the end of history, if you like, had a double edge. It wasn't just closing down ideological avenues of exploring. Klaus Offer says, by the way, that Germany was unified so quickly to prevent those who wanted a democratic socialism to develop in the GDR, East Germany. And well, many argue that it was an Anschluss to stop that. And at the same time, equally at the same time, that the security structures based on the political West, on the West, were then basically, instead of them being transformed at this moment, they simply enlarged, which is what provoked, in my view, the war in which we are now stuck. So that's the first part of your question. The second one is, as for socialism, this is, I've thought, and I'm working on this now. There is a desperate need for a type of humane, as you put it, and as Gorbachev put it, a humane democratic socialism. That capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, has clearly gone far too far. What has it done? Not just a financialization where every day $7.1 trillion are flowing in financial circulation, which means that actual trade is a marginal element in all of this. But worse than that, what's happened as part of the neoliberal revolution in the United States, in the United Kingdom, to a lesser degree in some major European states, but even in Sweden nowadays, the effectiveness, the efficiency of the government of the state doing things and doing good things with a vision of development, peaceful development, of nurturing its own people has gone. And instead of which, this is the most spectacular case of this, is, well, earlier New Labour, which was basically a continuation of Thatcherism by other means, perhaps a more humane type of Thatcherism. But today we have a Labour government in the United Kingdom headed by Keir Starmer. They came to power with a huge majority in July 2024, and they do not have a clue how to govern. They're absolutely devoid of an intellectual agenda. Starmer has only got one object, is to destroy the left of the Labour Party. So he's turned it into a magnificent machine. But the Labour Party, as Harold Wilson used to say, is a movement or it is nothing. And so it has now become precisely a Wilsonian nothing. And instead of which, this government, our British government, hasn't got a clue. And this is the government that is actually turning to militarism, though not putting the money behind it. And other European countries, they're totally devoid of a European agenda, pan-European agenda, devoid of a peace agenda, devoid of a developmental agenda, because this neoliberalism has hollowed out not just of governance, not just governance, hollowed out local government, certainly in the United Kingdom. It's hollowed out the vision of what a government should be doing. And what it should be doing is, you call it socialism, call it what you like, but of with a vision of how to make life better. And that does include taming the unrestricted power of the market. I actually think, I actually do think that the market, in other words, limit the power of capital, if you like. So I would be, clearly now, given the Soviet experience, we're talking about market socialism of one form or another. And we have to use the market, but the market as the servant of society, not its master. And
Very,
that's
very true.
and that is
Very
what
true words.
socialism is.
Yeah. Yes, before I move on to the final question, I found it quite, since you went into the Labour Party and your current Prime Minister, I found it quite amusing that I think a little more than a month ago he gave a speech saying that China was a clear threat to the national security of the United Kingdom and Britain, and today he's shaking hands and smiling with the Chinese president, and obviously all
Mm.
this it's not based on any reality. It's just based on posturing, in
Yes,
lack of any vision, as you say. But
absolutely.
time flies, and I would just like to you like to pick your brain once again, returning to Russia, since Russia is always very interesting for the Swedish audience. Uh, the system in Russia right now, there is a paradox. In the 90s, when I was living in St. Petersburg, we had a fellow there named Putin, who was working in the shadows, and we all know what happened to him. But uh, the system in Russia today somehow is very centered around Putin, but it must, no matter how you look at it, it must outlast the leader. So, given Putin's role as a very successful manager has been kind of central to the stability of Russia, uh, what, in your view, is the process of replacing Putin within the framework and structure of the Russia that he has built during the last decades? Would it lead to a collapse, a power struggle amongst fractions, or has there already been a kind of managed transition, or will it be left to a totally democratic process in the sense that we know it? What's your take on the post-Putin Russia that's coming?
Yeah. This is, of course, a crucial question because Putin is now, well, last October, 73 years old. Yeah,
Right.
okay. Trump seems to be going on well into his 80s, and Biden hoped to,
Ooh.
but nevertheless, yes, yes,
We,
it's a
we, 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 we don't want to go there with Putin.
no, no. But still, I mean, he's looking up. He's looking still, extraordinarily physically strong and active mentally, and quite clear. But he won't certainly go on forever. And indeed, this succession question is always the trap for any authoritarian system: is how to manage the succession. And of course, he at the moment no one is going to talk openly about it with Putin uh, at the moment. But my view is that those who say that this system has to be destroyed to allow a democratic revolution to take place, I disagree completely. That I think that, and those who even go further, and these are some of the liberal opposition in the West, arguing that the whole state needs to be dismantled, just like the Soviet Union was, to allow places like Tatarstan, Chechnya, Ingushetia, and so on, Bashkortostan, etc., to become independent. This is not the way to go, in my view. That and I would even go further. Yes, we've got a very personalistic leader. That Putin is an extraordinary historical phenomenon, even as we speak now. And obviously, opinion polling in wartime is very beset with all sorts of difficulties. But the Levada polls say that he's still enjoying 80-odd% support. Amazing. After 25 years as president, he is an absolute historical phenomenon. This isn't an endorsement or it's not a criticism. It's simply a fact that the Putin phenomenon is really one of the most astonishing political phenomena of our times. And he's certainly a leader, head and shoulders amongst most of our leaders, again, for good or ill. So the question of succession, I believe two things: that in the most simple level, there's a whole stack of people who could take over and who would be Putinist in their views. This is that they would have a statist ideology, that they would have agree with the basic principles of the Putinite state and ideology, that Russia has to stick true to its own traditions, that it cannot join now the political West. It has to act as a sovereign, independent state, hopefully in good relations with all of its neighbors and close and far. So there's a whole. Well, I could mention Duman, one of the governors, others who, but above all, the system, the constitutional state, is quite robust, I think. The parliament, the prime minister, and technically, the prime minister takes over if anything happens to the leader. And the prime minister today is this fellow called Mikhail Mishustin. He is a technocratic figure and extraordinarily effective. He used to be head of the tax system until he became prime minister in 2020. And in the 10 years he led the tax system, he transformed it. It's way ahead of anything we have in the United Kingdom. Basically, every time you buy something in a shop, it's automatically registered. At the end of the tax year, you press a button and hey presto, it's all sorted. It's unbelievable. And of course, also under his leadership, electronic government is way ahead of anything we have in the United Kingdom. I don't want to denigrate what we have here. There's a lot of good stuff developing in England as well. I leave aside Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, who have their own systems. But it's extraordinary development going on, and indeed, the society and the economy have developed enormously. It's a very complex society. The constitutional framework is very robust in my view. Yes, undermined by arbitrariness, selective judgment, everything like this, of course. The courts suborned. But given a thaw, given a relaxation of the Khrushchev type, the system, the Putinite, well, let's just say the post-communist polity is a viable one. We need to revive federalism as a genuine working, inter-ethnic tolerance and maybe a bit more diversity, but the system can continue, whereas the Soviet system had flaw right from its very core, and that is the dual power between the Communist Party and the institutions of the state, which was right there under Lenin all the way from the beginning. We don't have that now. There's no Communist Party. So, and of course, the parties need to be revived as far more genuine, democratic, political organizations. In other words, I believe that there can be an evolution after Putin, and the last thing we need is another revolution like 1991 or 1917. It would be catastrophic. So evolution, not revolution, but an evolution towards a genuinely more democratic, more competitive, more pluralistic, more tolerant society. But there are all those elements. Can I give you just one final story, for example? Not long ago, I was in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, and it was amongst the Tatar community, the southern part. There's a lot of Tatars next door to Tatarstan. And it just happened in this village, in this small town, there was this cultural festival. And for the whole afternoon, absolutely gorgeous. The Tatars were singing in Tatar, music and poems and songs and so on and so forth. At the end of it, it was marvelous. There were several hundred people there in the old Soviet-style palace of culture. And at the end of it, the deputy governor responsible for cultural matters gave a speech in Russian, and then they all stood up and sang the Russian national anthem. It's this system. There's loads of flaws and problems. I'm not trying to sweep them under the carpet in Russia. There always will be. A vast country, but 146 million people who are basically European in their orientations. They want to become part of a genuine pan-European human cultural educational community. And therefore, what really frightens me now is this war fever which has gripped us. And in Sweden, for example, these vicious nuns with submachine guns. Is that what it was? Really subverting it. It's madness. Really. And of course, the German yesterday saying we've got to get ready for 1,000 casualties a day and so on. We need to fight this war fever and say, no, we need a politics of reconciliation. And we need to end this Ukrainian war as a first thing to begin that, and not allow the Ukrainians, who've really been stoking these divisions with the support of London and Washington for so long. And we Europeans need to say, no, we want a different politics. We want to go back to the promise that we had of the European Union as a peace project, and it's now becoming a war project under that dreadful Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, Publius, and these other warmongers.
Yes, very true words. It's and of course there is always has always been this dream. I would say ever since the Crimean War, when the British were looking at using the Ottoman Empire as a way to get to Russia. Now they're using Ukraine as a way to get to Russia, and the same people who were doing that then, they are somewhere in the palaces of power today. The nefarious MI6 with its cronies are always working on somehow trying to deconstruct Russia. And I think that there is a great danger, as you say. I think Russia can develop, but the problem is there will always be certain exterior forces that will try to break Russia instead of reform it. But that would if we go into that, we would be here for another hour, and we have already spoken now for about an hour. And I would like to thank you very much for your time, and hopefully you will get some orders on your books here in Sweden after people have discovered you. I know I will pop over to the bookstore straight across or a few streets down from my apartment and order a few of your books and read them with pleasure. And we will also give some links to your online material for our listeners so they can dig deeper into your teachings.
Lovely. Thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking with you, I must say. It's really good.
The same. Thank you very much.
And goodbye then.
Bye. Thanks.